From the Missouri School of Journalism, welcome to Global Journalist. I'm Jason McClure. In October, Indonesia inaugurated its first president who is neither from the military nor one of the country's elite political families. Joko Widodo, or as he's more popularly known, Jokowi, won just over 53% of the vote in June and began his 5-year term on October 20th. The man he beat, Prabowo Subianto, was a former military general who is seen by some as being too close to business as usual. The Economist described Jokowi as the anti-candidate, citing his down-to-earth campaign style, his connections with the country's poor, and his quirks, like a love of the heavy metal music bands, Metallica, and Megadeth. As former governor of Jakarta, Jokowi expanded health care for the poor and streamlined its transportation services. As president, he faces challenges like combating corruption throughout the government, reducing poverty, and maintaining Indonesia's impressive economic growth. Right now, Jokowi and other leaders, including President Obama, are meeting in Myanmar as part of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, or ASEAN Summit, where issues like trade and regional collaboration are expected to be discussed. This week on Global Journalist, we talk about the rise of Jokowi and what's next for Indonesia. We are joined today from Jakarta by Benjamin Bland, a reporter for the Financial Times, from Washington, D.C. by Vibhanshu Shekhar, a scholar in residence at American University's School of International Service, and from Jakarta by Andreas Harsono, a researcher with Human Rights Watch. Welcome to all of you. Vibhanshu Shekhar, I wanted to ask you, what is it about Jokowi that has made him such a popular figure in Indonesia? Tell us a little bit about his background.
Well, a lot has been written about his background, and he's seen as clean. He's seen as hardworking. He's seen as a very down to earth person who has risen without any a high level or elite military background or political background. His own party's boss, Megawati Sukarno Putri, who happens to be the daughter of late Sukarno, or his rival candidate, Prabowo Subianto, who has had a very illustrious family background as well. But compared to both of these, he comes from a very common background. And he's seen as clean, he's seen as hardworking, he's relatively young and visionary. He's also, liked and loved by Indonesians in general, not just for music, like heavy metal, but also for, for someone who's making, who's promising that he'll make Indonesia a clean and, a prosperous country.
Ben Bland in Jakarta, we heard Vibhanshu Shekhar talk about Jokowi as being sort of a young, energetic politician from a humble background, someone that's generated a lot of excitement in Indonesia politically. That's led to comparisons between Jokowi and Barack Obama in 2008. What do you make of that?
Well, given Barack Obama's recent performance in the midterms, I'm not sure it's a comparison that Jokowi would much appreciate at this moment in time. But of course, previously people compared his rise from obscurity to that of Barack Obama, although actually their backgrounds are somewhat different. Obama obviously went to Harvard Law School, which is in many ways a training ground for the top echelons of US politics. And Jokowi was a small-scale furniture salesman who worked his way up first as mayor of his hometown and then as governor of Jakarta. So people obviously like an easy comparison, and he has come from nowhere to lead the world's third biggest democracy. So that's there. I mean, interestingly, another comparison is the fact that, like Obama, Jokowi doesn't really have support in the Indonesian legislature. So the parties that backed him actually have a minority position, and that obviously is making investors and Indonesians somewhat nervous after all the hype and the excitement about what Jokowi will actually be able to achieve, especially because they've seen what happened to Barack Obama in the US facing a divided Congress.
Andreas Harsono with Human Rights Watch in Jakarta. Indonesia's military has long played a large role in politics there. In 2001, the president at the time, Abdurrahman Wahid, was impeached after the military had surrounded the presidential palace with troops and tanks. Can you talk about what is Jokowi's relationship with the military and what challenges are there for him with that institution?
So far, it is still, a honeymoon period. We still do not know for sure where it is going to go. Although, interestingly, in June during the campaign, Jokowi promised if elected, he will end the isolations of Indonesia natural rich province of Papua. And that is something that the military might be upset about because it is an area where the military has control over the last 50 years with their own self-business interests, with their promotion, with their many military spending, big budget, weapons, toys, etc. That's why I'm a little bit curious if Jokowi, like what he has promised, he will open up Papua, like what he had said during the campaign. What is the indicator? The indicator in July, an early challenge to Jokowi intention was that the Indonesian police, of course, with the backing of the military, arrested 2 French journalists in Papua on charges that they did not use proper journalist visa. They used tourist visa instead. The problem is, if a journalist, foreign journalist, would like to go to Papua, you need to get the signature, the approval of 18 government agencies, including the military intelligence, including the police. And it is extremely difficult for foreign journalists to get it.
Vibanshu Shekhar, Andreas Harsono was speaking about tensions in the province of Papua. That's on the large island of New Guinea, north of Australia. Could you tell us just a little bit about some of the human rights issues there? What is it about the history of Papua in Indonesia that has led to there being so much conflict there?
Well, going into history is like almost trying to recap like 50 years of like what has happened between, that involved Indonesia's own independence, that involved Indonesia's own state-building process, and how the Indonesian government has tried to coordinate its own, growth during the last 30, 40, since 63, when the first agreement was signed, and since then West Papua, then it was Irian Jaya. They later on, the homegrown insurgency in West Papua that has come up and that has been there since the last 30, 40 years, and they have demanded independence. So the Indonesian government that was under Suharto, that was led by the military, has responded pretty effectively, brutally, and in a very sustained, oppressive manner there in West Papua that has sustained further the demand for greater rights and also greater movement in the region. At the same time, that has led to a kind of spiral effect with military responding to it. So military responds oppressively. The people there, they demand more and more rights, and this cycle has to end somewhere. And somewhere so one can hope that under a clean and forward-looking government like Jokowi, one can hope that there will be a better future for West Papua, where some of these human rights violations and they will come down over say during the next 5 years.
Ben Bland, Andreas Harsono was talking about the arrest of French journalists in Papua recently. You're there as an international correspondent as well. Have you had similar difficulties with the Indonesian government?
Well, the issue is, I think is laid out by Andreas, that foreign journalists are free to travel anywhere in Indonesia apart from Papua, where you need to get special permission via the foreign ministry, and they need to get the approval of various other government departments. And that means that in the last few years, a handful of foreign journalists they have got these official permits. Many others have tried and failed. So it's a mixed bag, and it obviously depends on what you're going there to research. I think if you say that you want to go and investigate the insurgency, it's obviously a lot less likely that you will get permission. If you want to investigate cultural issues, then it's perhaps easier. But it's complex. However, I would say that the issue does need to be seen in the historical context. That up until 1998, Indonesia had very tight controls on media, foreign media, and domestic media everywhere. And if you look across Asia in general, Indonesia still does have one of the freest environments for journalists. And Indonesian journalists are relatively free to travel to Papua. So it is probably the last remaining reminder of the sort of media controls that were put in place by the Suharto dictatorship over 32 years. But in many other regards, Indonesia is actually a relatively straightforward place to be a journalist in terms of traveling where you want.
This is Global Journalist. I'm Jason McClure. On this week's program, we are talking about the rise of Indonesia's new president, Jokowi, and what's next for the Southeast Asian nation. We are joined today from the capital, Jakarta, by Benjamin Bland of the Financial Times, from Washington, D.C. by Vibanshu Shekhar at American University's School of International Service, and from Jakarta by Andreas Harsono, a researcher with Human Rights Watch. If you're interested in more Global Journalist content, visit us online at globaljournalist.org. There you can read in-depth articles on international affairs and free press issues and download past episodes from our archive. We're also on social media. You can like us on Facebook or follow us on Twitter at GlobalJourn. Andreas Harsono, I wanted to ask you, you're a researcher with Human Rights Watch. Under Jokowi's predecessor, Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono, I understand there had been something like 80 cases of blasphemy, and we also saw a number of restrictions on religious minorities, on Shias, on Christians in Indonesia. Given that Indonesia has a reputation as sort of a moderate Islamic country, why did we see that, and how do you expect the new president to address religious matters?
Well, basically, over the last 10 years, under President Yudhoyono, he introduced a new concept. Instead of religious freedom, he introduced a concept called religious harmony. What is it? Religious harmony basically believes that the majority should protect the minority. Meanwhile, the minority religion have to respect the majority. Based on this concept, he strengthened the blasphemy law. He introduced a new law on building houses of worship, make it extremely difficult for minorities to build churches or temples. Also, under this concept of religious harmony, Yudhoyono introduced, basically limited Muslim minorities like the Shia, like the Ahmadiyya, like the Sufi, that they consider to be, blasphemous. Because of all this discriminatory regulation, and he also allowed Muslim Sunni militants to take the law into their hands, attacking churches, attacking Christian, attacking Ahmadiyya, attacking Shia, and with relative impunity. Some were arrested, but the punishment is relatively minor. The question is, just some statistic, more than 600 churches have already been closed down under Yudhoyono rule in 10 years. Ahmadiyya, more than 100 mosques have already been closed down. Hundreds of Shia were taken away from their houses in the villages. The question is, will President Jokowi spend some political capital to undo what Yudhoyono had done? Will President Jokowi review and revoke discriminatory regulations that Yudhoyono had installed? Yudhoyono did not only write regulation, he also set up a new institution called Religious Harmony Forum on the regency level, city level, provincial level. So they are institutionalized now. Can Jokowi undo that? Will he spend money? Will he spend political capital to, basically fire thousands of these religious harmony officials? So we have to wait and see.
Vibanshu Shekhar, we heard Andreas Harsono talking about Jokowi possibly, the questions about Jokowi expending political capital on some of these religious issues. He came in to power talking about the economy. Talk to us about some of the economic challenges he faces, I understand one of his first initiatives is to reduce fuel subsidies, which consume something like 20% of Indonesia's budget. Can you talk to us a little bit about how you think he may go about addressing economic problems?
Well, he has, come to power with a lot of promises that he has made during the elections. Now the question is, all these promises, they require a lot of funding, a lot of resources that the government needs to generate. And where the government would generate resources from, one is of course, on the other hand, they have areas such as fuel subsidy, for example, that's taking up resources. So one of the ways the government is trying to do is the government is trying to reach to the global community. Recently, the Indonesian president at APEC meeting in Beijing and also in Naypyidaw in Myanmar, he was seen inviting investors, global investors and companies to come and invest in Indonesia. So this is one of the ways to generate resources by the new government. But this is not enough. The government has to address some of the critical issues. That's where, for example, fuel subsidy, but I'm not sure whether the government can do much on that count. He has promised that he will work on that. It's a minority government. It has a limited, mandate within the parliament. And as we have seen previously on the direct elections at the local level, at the provincial level, at the mayoral level, gubernatorial level, they have been scrapped. And even though this party didn't want it, they couldn't do anything on that. So when it comes to substantial issues where, where a lot of national opinion needs to be mobilized, and mind you, the previous government, government, even when they were departing, they didn't do anything on fuel subsidies. So I'm not sure if they have a lot of resources, they will be able to create a lot of resources to spend. On the other hand, they're making a lot of promises to spend, whether it's in the healthcare, whether it's in the defense sector, whether it's in terms of infrastructure sector. So that's the bind that the government is in. It has to find a way out.
Ben Bland, I wanted to ask you about Indonesia's prospects for growing its economy. A lot of its growth in recent years, and the growth has been relatively impressive over the past decade, has been from exporting commodities like coal, palm oil, minerals. Why is it that Indonesia, even though it's the fourth most populous country in the world, why is it that it hasn't become a manufacturing hub like some of its neighbors in East Asia?
Well, in the 1990s, Indonesia did actually become quite an important global center for international manufacturing. But unfortunately, after the Asian financial crisis, manufacturing and it has actually shrunken as a share of the economy overall, and that's partly because other sectors that you referred to, commodity production, was booming over much of the last 10 years, and that was driven by the rise of China and its economy, which had a huge hunger for the kinds of resources that Indonesia was producing, the coal, palm oil, rubber, copper, etc. So that commodity-driven turbocharged growth of the last decade allowed the government in many ways to overlook some of the key structural problems economically that I think Vibanshu was referring to, the wasteful spending on fuel subsidies, the lack of spending and investment in healthcare, education and infrastructure. So there was a commodity boom. These key issues were ignored, but in the last 2 years, we've seen China's economy slowing down as Beijing really tries to restructure its economy to be more driven by consumption, by technological innovation. And as its demand for these commodities has fallen, the prices have dropped, and Indonesia now faces a squeeze. So economic growth has fallen from around 6.5% at its peak in 2011 to just 5% now. And Jokowi faces a big challenge if he wants to get the economy growing again without the crutch, if you like, of these commodity exports.
You're listening to Global Journalist. I'm Jason McClure. On this week's program, we are talking about the rise of Indonesia's new president, Jokowi, and what's next for the Southeast Asian nation. We are joined today from Jakarta by Benjamin Bland, a reporter for the Financial Times. From Washington, D.C., by Vibanshu Shekhar, a scholar in residence at American University's School of International Service. And from Jakarta, by Andreas Harsono, a researcher with Human Rights Watch. For more Global Journalist content, visit us online at globaljournalist.org. On our website, you can read in-depth articles on international affairs and free press issues and download past episodes from our archive. We're also on social media. You can like us on Facebook or follow us on Twitter at Global Journ. Andreas Harsono, could you tell us a little bit about the problem of corruption in Indonesia, which I understand is endemic? How does this play out in the lives of ordinary citizens? How do they see and touch and experience corruption?
I like to recite an essay written by Indonesian essayist Gunawan Muhammad. He noticed that every morning in a police station, they hang on a line of paper money bill. It turned out that all of those bills are wet and has already been washed. He was curious and he asked the police, why do they wash them? It turned out that all those money came from truck drivers who have to bribe the police. But before they bribing the police, they spit on the money. So the money is, of course, dirty and have to be rinsed. And thus, every morning they line up all the bills. So that is a
So the truck drivers spit on the paper money before they give it to the
Yes.
police as bribes?
That's right. They fold the money and they put their spit inside the money. And they usually give the money to the police. And the police take them. The police also know that all those drivers are really angry with them, pissed off with the policemen. But at the same time, the driver also cannot not bribing the police officers. That is happening. It shows the reality in Indonesia. Police officer, prosecutors, judges, you name them, government officers, they all take petty cash. If you go to a district office, you need to pay $1, $2, $5, $10 just for every signature that you need. But that's why the Jokowi presidency is interesting, because he belongs to a new group of Indonesian elected officials who try to be clean, who try not to be corrupted, who try to have an efficient government service in Indonesia.
Ben Bland, I wanted to ask you about Islamic extremism in Indonesia. Many of our listeners will recall the bombings in Bali in 2002 that killed over 200 people. There were bombings again in 2005 that killed another 20. How active are Islamic extremist groups in Indonesia now? How do you anticipate that Jokowi will deal with this issue?
Well, first, I'd obviously just like to pay tribute to Andreas's fine description there of money laundering Indonesian style. But on the issue of Islamic extremism in Indonesia, and I suppose terrorism as well, which you're referring to, in the early 2000s, there was a big problem here. There was the bombs in Bali, and there were bomb attacks at the Australian embassy and leading international hotels in Jakarta. But the police eventually launched a pretty tough crackdown with funding from the US, Australia, and technical assistance as well. And since 2009, there hasn't been a major terrorist attack on an international target. Because the big terrorist groups which had links to foreign funding, foreign financing, foreign skills as well, have been broken up, and the main protagonists were either arrested or shot and killed by the Indonesian counter-terrorism police. But what you've seen since then is really a fracturing of those groups, and they've tended to switch to more local targets. So they're attacking individual Indonesian police officers, police stations. So it seems there's been a fractured movement, but there's definitely been a renewed concern in Indonesia in the last 6 months to a year, as there have been in many other countries in the world, because of the rise of ISIS or the Islamic State. And a number of Indonesians are known to have traveled to Syria or Iraq to join the armed groups there. And there's a concern here, as there is in the United States, in the UK, and many other countries, about what might happen when those fighters do return. But I would stress that So far the Indonesian government has talked about 50 or 100 people fighting in Syria. We don't know if those figures are accurate, but that is less than the numbers who've gone from the United Kingdom or many European countries. So I'm not sure it's necessarily a much more serious problem in Indonesia than it is in many other countries, which is in a way quite remarkable given that this is the world's biggest Muslim majority nation.
Vibanshu Shekhar at American University. Indonesia is the third largest democracy in the world. It covers a huge swath of the Indian Ocean. Tell us just a little bit about its relationships with some of its neighbors, how its foreign policy might change under Jokowi. There's a perception that Indonesia maybe punches below its weight in international affairs.
Well, so there has been a sense that Indonesia has been an underachiever. And during the last 10 years under the government, there has been an effort on the part of the Indonesian strategic community to get out of that underachievement status to go towards more larger regional outlook. And that broader regional outlook is Indo-Pacific that now strategic committee is talking about. And in that context, there is a certain, kind of fundamental churning that is taking place within Indonesia. If we look at it, there are three key components of this. One, to go maritime. In the earlier context under Suharto regime, even though Indonesia was perceived as an archipelagic state, the security doctrine revolved around a continental setup. And where they had all the guerrilla strategy and basing the army within a particular island and then trying to address the issue. Now they're trying to have a more maritime outlook. So continental to maritime, that's an important security doctrine shift that has taken place. One. Two, Indonesia is also trying to go out of its own regional, sub-regional Southeast Asian confinement. Now, it's talking about going towards Indo-Pacific that covers a bigger triangular space between India on the left side, Japan on the northeastern side, and Australia on the south. So this is a much broader space that Indonesia wants to play its role in. And this is the second important. The third is, of course, it's trying to go towards playing a more active global role, hinging on this broader regional outlook. And democracy is certainly an important means to pursue that foreign diplomacy goal. These are three important components. I hope I'm making myself clear.
That was very clear. We're going to have to leave it there. That's all for this edition of Global Journalist, a production of the Reynolds Journalism Institute and the Missouri School of Journalism. Many thanks to Benjamin Bland, Vibanshu Shekhar, and Andreas Harsono for joining us. Global Journalist executive producer is Casey Morell. This week's lead producer is Tatiana Dare, with assistance from Bida Iqbali, Batul Hassan, and Anna Kowalska. Our technical director is Travis McMillan from RJI, and our audio engineer is Pat Akers of KBIA. For all of us at Global Journalist, I'm Jason McClure. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you next time.